Let me put the captions on. Check 1, 1, 2. All right, perfect. How's it going, class? We are at the end of the summer session. This is our last full week. You do have some stuff next week, but that is much more abbreviated and much shorter because we technically end on the 14th. That's 10 days from now. Next week is not a reading intensive week. It's for us to get those final assignments in, for you to write those final papers. And I have a video I want you all to watch, which is one of the best documentaries, I think, that's been made in recent years, at least as it pertains to the concept of race, and some of our issues in the judicial system here in the United States. So I want you to watch that, and I want you to engage that in your discussions, and I'll even hop in for our last discussion round. But you will not have a checkpoint next week. You will only have the discussion post and the final paper to turn in. So shorter week, but less to do. Okay, well, unless, you know, the final paper is difficult. I don't know. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go over our 5 readings for the week. I will focus mainly on the John Stuart Mill, the Charles Mills, basically everything except for the Carol Pateman reading. I think that one's very self-explanatory, and it's actually more of an anthropological piece or historical poli-sci piece than it is a philosophy piece. But I wanted you all to see how this applies both with race and sex gender. So I'll briefly talk about that one, but the rest of them I have nice, neat PowerPoints for you all to look at as I run through them. So the best place to start is probably with John Stuart Mill. Oh, I'm sorry. Rousseau is probably the best place to start. So let's look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And let me put my slideshow on. Okay. So the first thing that you all should know is that Jean-Jacques Rousseau is actually one of our later theorists when it comes to social contract theory. I deeply encourage you all to watch the supplementary video that I posted about social contract theory. It walks you through Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and how those 3 different approaches to contract theory really are distinct. But I like to teach Rousseau because I find Rousseau's to be at least semi-optimistic, a little positivist. I think it's helpful, even though I think John Locke's is the closest to how we understand it here in the United States. And for those of you all who don't know, Thomas Jefferson basically rips off John Locke on a lot of what he wrote, specifically when it comes to our United States framework. So John Locke says life, liberty, and the preservation of property. And, you know, Thomas Jefferson says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Just as one example, it shows up in this entire corpus. So let's talk about what it means to socially contract with one another. Thomas Hobbes thought that we lived in this super violent, naturally aggressive society. And so the only way that we could have civility or some sort of peace among us is to surrender some of our freedoms to, you know, what he called, what was his word in the Leviathan? For Rousseau, it's going to be the sovereign, but surrendering it basically to the government, right? So the idea here is that we are surrendering a certain set of freedoms and we're agreeing to a certain set of rules so that we can have what we call a civil state. Now, automatically, you should feel some trouble with this, mainly in the Thomas Hobbes sense, because again, he is a 17th or 16th century theorist who was basically talking about this as it pertains to indigenous folks, right? The so-called savage. And the whole idea here is that civility is already not established, so we have to establish a certain type of civility and call that what is socially correct. That should already make you all feel a little weird, and you should deeply investigate what exactly that means. The settling of the United States, for example, insinuates that there was something unsettled prior to the pilgrims or colonists from the European nations coming to the United States. You should dig deep into what that means, right? If something was already not settled, then it says something very specific about how indigenous life was working. But Thomas Hobbes starts us on this idea of, oh, this violence, and we would rob each other. And basically, I use the movie The Purge as a great example of how Hobbes is thinking about the state of nature. And he thinks it's naturally violent. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a little different, right? So the first thing that Rousseau argues, and let me move my little camera thing here, is that there needs to be a balance between utility and justice. You know what the word utility means. He's talking about it in the John Stuart Mill sense. So usefulness and justice. He develops this idea called the sovereign, okay? I like to think of the sovereign in terms of Power Rangers. If you all have ever seen any of the shows or whatever, right? The separate Power Rangers are one thing, and then they come together to make this Megazord, and the Megazord is supposed to be the symmetry of all the equal separate parts into one cohesion. That's what he calls the sovereign. It's the general will of the populace into one body politic, right? So he thinks that the government should function as this sort of personification or manifestation of the general will of the people. Problem is that we don't always agree, right? Here's probably the most famous quote by Rousseau. He says, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they." If I had you all in class, we would literally break into groups and try to figure out what the heck is going on here. But I want you to take it piece by piece. There's an existential sort of notion being given in the first sentence or first clause, right? Man is born free. There is a sense of freedom that is inherent in our humanity as we are thrown into the world. Yet when we arrive in the world, we find ourselves everywhere in chains. So those chains are a product of the world. Some of them are socially manufactured. Some of them might be natural, but we find ourselves in these sorts of chains. And when we think that we are masters of others, right? When we think that we're better, when we think that we have an edge over somebody else, when we try to put someone else into a sense of servitude, we find ourselves actually being greater slaves than they because we are ignoring or trying to bypass our own freedom. This is what Sartre talks about in the idea of bad faith, right? That we are trying to lie to ourselves about our actual sovereignty over other people is one of the ways in which we can exist in bad faith. So he says the social order is a sacred right, which is the basis of all other rights. Nevertheless, the right does not come from nature and must therefore be founded on convention. So this idea of man being born free may have some sort of metaphysical properties in it, but in order for it to actually come into fruition in our political landscape, we have to make that be the case, right? So we have to socially construct this idea of freedom, just like we socially construct ideas of race, ideas of gender, etc. So the sovereign, I won't take you through all of that, but you can read that focus passage for yourself. I'll just get a little small piece of it, look at about the middle. As a member of the sovereign, he is bound to the individuals, and as a member of the state, to the sovereign. But the maximum of civil right, that no one is bound by undertakings made of himself, does not apply in this case. For there is a great difference between incurring an obligation to yourself and incurring one to the whole of which you form a part, right? So this is a different way for us to think about society. If I am part of the sovereign, right, Megazord idea, then that means that even if I'm just the leg, I have a certain sort of connection and responsibility to the arm. and so on and so forth, right? So the idea of my civil duty toward myself is different than what I inherit as an obligation to the rest of the politic if we understand the sovereign as this collective of people. So there's a couple of things he lays out. He thinks that the sovereign is inalienable, right? We hold these truths to be inalienable. You can't violate it, right? Indivisible. You can't divide it. Infallible. Fascinating. But then he gives some addendums, right? It follows that what has gone before, that the general will is always right and tends to the public advantage. But it does not follow that the deliberations of the people are always equally correct. Our will is always for our own good, but we do not always see what that is, that people is never corrupted, or the people is never corrupted, but is often deceived, and on such occasions only does it seem the will to be bad, right? I want you to think about this. If we all were trying to take care of the whole, and we had that without greed, without self-desire, all those sorts of things, then there might be a universe where we are infallible, right? There might be a universe where we are not, we don't mess up. The problem is that we tend to think about things for our own good, and we are also easily deceived. And those things make it such that the people can have a bad will, which then makes the sovereign have a bad will. So there's a couple of precautions he gives. The general will is able to express itself. There's no partial society within the state, and that each citizen should think only his own thoughts. Okay. These precautions are the only ones that can guarantee that the will always be enlightened. Cool. Let's talk a little bit about agency, right? Agency. Again, we talk about this in philosophy. We use the word agent to be a sort of gender neutral as well as politically neutral sort of caricature that talks about any entity that's able to have responsibility for itself and is recognized as something worthy of certain rights or certain sentience, whatever, right? So agency then is the way in which I can be responsible for the self and the way in which I am an agent that certain things should not be able to be done to me. This is, again, that difference between positive and negative rights, where positive rights are the things that I am free to do, and the negative rights are the things that you are not allowed to do to me, right? So this is anchored in an idea about the first sort of government or society is the family, but automatically you should see issues with this, right? Look at the focus passage at the bottom. The family then may be called blah, 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 blah. The ruler corresponds to the father, and the people to children, and all being born free and equally alienate their liberty only for their own advantage, right? The whole difference is that in the family, the love of the father for his children repays him for the care he takes for them, I guess. And in the state, the pleasure of commanding, blah, 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 blah. What I need you all to get here is that the way in which we understand our government is based on an idea of patriarchy. This is why the Carol Pateman reading is relevant, because the first society, as it's understood, is to function like a traditional colonial idea of a family does, where there's the father, he's the property owning one, he's the one that makes all the shots. There are the women and children are considered under the purview of the father. And the whole idea of marriage, again, is the giving away of the daughter from the father to the husband, who then becomes new father, right? That's why patriarch is partly based on the idea of wealth, which is why some cultures require a dowry and things like that. And then it's also partially the idea of man owning to man owning as it pertains to the wife. This is why Carol Pateman says, even though people can have better reinventions of what marriage is now, the institution of marriage is patriarchal in its nature and in its substance. And we have to wrestle with the fact that this is our history and this is anchored in the way in which we understand connections between men and women. There's an automatic inequality there. And Rousseau is demonstrating it for us, right? So he bases this on the idea of Aristotle. I don't have enough time to walk you through the politics of Aristotle, specifically the first book of the Politics where he talks about natural slavery. But what I want you to understand is that he's anchoring his idea in uh, that slaves lose everything in their chains, even the desire of escaping from them. They love their servitude as comrades of Ulysses love their brutish condition. If then there are slaves by nature, it is because they have been slaves against nature. Force made them the first slaves, and their cowardice perpetuated the condition. Okay, you should already be like, ugh, this is making me feel nasty, right? So Aristotle thought that people could naturally be slaves. Rousseau says, I think you got the end part right. I don't think you got the rationale right. I don't think people are naturally like genome phenotype enslaved or slaves naturally. But what I do think is that there are aspects of force that make people enslaved, right? And then he has this thing about, well, he calls it cowardice, but I really think about what are the things that allow people to be perpetuated in servitude conditions, right? Why don't we resist? And there's a lot of reasons why we choose not to or strategically decide to resist. I don't think that's cowardice. I think that's a bad form of language. And I think Rousseau has to be held accountable for that. But what I do think we need to think about, though, is how do we set up a social framework that allows people to be free and equal if we have these sort of institutions and things at play that make people greater or less than others, right? So, we have an issue at play here. I'm looking at the second bullet in particular. Since no man has natural authority over his fellow, and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men. This is what we would call a syllogism, right? So what he's laying out here, and I'm gonna go to the first bullet, he says the strongest is never strong enough to always be the master. This is historically true. Nobody stays in power for forever and ever unless he transforms strength into right. I wish I had time for you all to discuss that and to theorize that, right? But if brute strength can't do it alone, what I have to do is condition people to think about what they deem as right and wrong in a certain way, and then the institution is never challenged, right? I turn obedience into duty. And then if force creates right, the effect changes with the cause. Every force that is greater than the first succeeds to its right. All he's saying is that it's not enough for me to just have all the guns or to have all of the manpower or whatever. Every time that we've tried to do that historically, that has fallen. What has been most successful when it comes to dominating other people is to get them to think about the world and themselves and their oppressor in certain ways. If I can change the mind, then I can successfully hold a people subservient. That is what Fanon talked about with the colonial mind state that is instilled into the Black. That is what many feminist scholars have talked about, the indoctrination of women into patriarchy. That is how you get people to vote against their own interests, etc. Right? I have to change the way you psychologically think about your morality, as well as politically what is right and wrong. Right? The rest I think is good. I think you need to know deeply about the sovereign and the relationship between the sovereign and the individual, right? The sovereign is made up of the individuals who compose it, neither has nor can have any interest contrary to theirs. You need to ask yourself the question, does the government have interests that are outside of mine? And if that's the case, it can't be a sovereign. And we need to question why that is, right? Because again, the whole idea is for government to serve the people, right? So I'll stop there. Yeah, that's enough. I think that's all you need from that. So let's stop share here. And now let's move over to what John Stuart Mill is talking about. So John Stuart Mill is the only theorist this semester that we're reading twice. You all read him for utilitarianism. Now we're thinking about what he's talking about with liberty in particular. There's one main point that I want us to sort of wrestle through, and that's the epistemic layers of society, right? When I say epistemic, again, that's the study of knowledge. So let's look at the central claims here. If it holds that human beings should be free from opinions without reserve, let's see if the same reasons justify people being free to act upon their opinions without hindrance, physical or moral, as long as it is to their own risk and peril. I usually like to think about this with my students via what happened on January 6th and our insurrection that happened here in the United States. And again, I'm using their language. I don't view it as an insurrection per se. There's a criterion for insurrectionist ethics that's been developed in philosophy by people like Lee McBride, like Jacoby Carter, et cetera. I don't know if that's satisfactory, but that's what the public media has called it. So for the sake of this video, that's what I'm going to call it as well. He says, no one pretends that actions should be as free as opinions. On the contrary, even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they are expressed are such as they constitute their expression of positive indignation to some mischievous act. How do I hold people's opinions accountable? Right? You're free to have whatever opinion you want. We just talked in the last talk about freedom, that all men are naturally born free. But should you be held accountable if your opinion comes with mischievousness, a certain harm to someone else, etc.? I like to frame this class as the study of freedom when it inevitably crashes into someone else's freedom. That's the base of how we think about morality and political frameworks often, all right? You're free to do what you want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. All right. You're free to think what you want. But what happens when, I don't know, flat earthers or people who think that COVID-19 was a hoax, etc., when those opinions end up changing the way in which we engage in our social landscape, that actually can be quite risky, right? This week, you all saw Representative Marjorie Greene Taylor talk about, Dr. Fauci, who was our former head of health, right? Saying that he's not a real doctor. So I'm gonna call him Mr., right? The problem with that, you can have whatever opinion you want about his medical expertise. One, you shouldn't be calling people who haven't earned doctorate not doctor, right? But even beyond that, what I want you all to think about is, if you think this stuff is a hoax, you're going to engage the world in that same way. And then if it's not a hoax, then you have now endangered a whole set of population. This was the problem with COVID-19. And it's why we had literally thousands upon thousands of people, 1 million in total, right, die from this disease. Because I think there was a lot of people who operated on certain presumptions, and the ways in which they engaged the world followed that thought that they're free to have. And now we need to think about how we hold that sort of idea accountable, right? So this is really a talk about fake news, right? Which has been a buzzword in the last couple of years. They give us this corn dealer example, right? Let's say that there's this corn dealer who ends up being starvers of the poor, right? So do you have the right to go ahead and publish and say to the press, yes, this is somebody who is basically starving the poor? The problem with that is not your freedom, but then when an excited mob ends up assembled outside of the corn dealer's house, right? So now you have, in a sense, incited a mob. Should you be held accountable for that belief? This is really him getting to the center of what liberty is. Because again, is all of my freedom good? Is my unmitigated freedom a good thing, right? Straight up anarchy. You could do whatever you want. You got the biggest gun, you pay the cost to be the boss, right? So he says acts of whatever kind, which without justifiable cause do harms to others, may be, and in more important cases, absolutely required to be controlled by the unfavorable sentiments, excuse me, and when needful, by the active interference of mankind. So yes, you have freedom of speech, but does that mean that you have the freedom to call me the N-word? Right? That's a real question. So where do we put the limitations of freedom? This reading goes so well in tandem with the social contract piece, because now we're not just talking about how we contract together to make a civil state. Now we also have to beg the question of what does it mean to be free? And where do we draw the limits, or what freedoms do we surrender to have a good society, right? Now, I talk about this, and this is a diversion from you all's readings, but I think the best way to think about some of this is through Jose Medina's idea of epistemic friction, right? Beneficial versus detrimental epistemic friction. The goal is for us to have epistemic equilibrium, this balance between different ideals. So you have the left, you have the right, and then we find some balance between the two. You have Democrat, you have Republican, you have liberal or progressive versus conservative or traditional, etc. The problem is that we don't typically have beneficial epistemic friction. We usually have detrimental, which ends up with censoring and silencing, inhibiting beliefs. And that's the problem. The sovereign comes with us coming to cohesion on an idea. The way that the sovereign works is that we figure out what the majority of the people believe should be done, and then everybody within the sovereign gets on board with that idea. But that's not how we actually function. We think that's how voting works. That's not how voting works. We go by majority rules, and then if it's 51% versus 49%, 49% of the people stay pissed off, right? And they don't even really get on board with the idea. So we don't have an epistemic equilibrium there. What we have is a majority ruled, some people got what they wanted, other people left pissed off, right? So we have to deal with the idea of individuality. There are good things that can happen with it. There are also bad things that can happen with it. Because if we're only concerned with our individual selves, we're going to run into a problem. You don't need that focus passage. But then we also have to think about, when is civil disobedience necessary or permissible, right? We talked about that a little bit when we talked about King and the just and unjust laws stuff, right? You have that focus passage if you want to look at it. I don't think it's that relevant. Okay, stop share. 2 down, 3 to go. So now let's look at the racial contract, because this is using contract theory to think about issues of race. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we're doing Du Bois first. Okay, that's fine. So scratch that last piece. W.B. Du Bois is best known for the book Souls of Black Folk, but this is actually an excerpt from his book Dark Water, right? And I think this is one of the most masterful political pieces of all time that for some reason people don't teach, right? So let's talk about, what does it mean for us to establish a civil society, and who should be able to rule it, who should be able to participate in it, right? So the easiest way, he says, to rule is to the pleasure of the few, or the one, the rich, the privileged, and the powerful. But we should be thinking more about universal good than we do about the few. That's something that can be relevant to us even now, right? He talks a little bit about this thing that we call fate, right? And how people have used fate to talk about why captains of industries end up leading our society and becoming million and billionaires, right? He puts millionaires here because we didn't have such a thing as a billionaire in 1920, I don't believe, right? And then he thinks about philanthropy as this sort of scheme, right? It's this sort of plot for us to divert our eyes away from the actual issues of our society. Because now it's about people having goodwill to rectify the issues that our social framework has made, right? So I think that's powerful. So he says there's certain people who have been deemed restricted from the ruling of men. First one is the ignorant, right? Those who don't have the intellectual tools, whether that's by capacity or just straight up knowledge, right, to participate. It's very weird for people to vote and don't even know who's on the ballot, what they stand for, etc., right? But people do it all the time. The inexperienced, those who don't know how politics works. The guarded, meaning that those who have some sort of representational person in between them and the state, right? Here he's talking about not just like slave owners and things like that, but like anybody who serves as representative for others. Du Bois, along with John Stuart Mill, are some of our folks who have complicated but essential writings when it comes to the liberation of women, right? And then he says the unwilling, those who don't want to participate, right? These restrictions are not arguments for the wide distribution of the ballot. They are rather reasons for the restriction addressed to the self-interest of the present real rulers. Instead of saying the ignorant should not be able to vote, Du Bois says, no civilized state should have citizens too ignorant to participate in government. Education is not a prerequisite of political control. Political control is the cause of popular education. Drop the mic, right? So what he's saying here is that if we were to have a civil state, it's our job to make sure that every single citizen in the polis, to use Aristotle's language, is educated enough to be able to participate well. So I'm just a crazy, conspiracy theorist to a certain extent, where I see a direct correlation between the stifling of knowledge that's happening, this dismantling and this issue of public education that works in tandem with some people being able to call all the shots and a lot of people just having to deal with the effects. That's something that you should think about. Why is it that we still, after millions of, I won't say millions, thousands of articles and books that have been written on improving our education system, why is this thing still not fixed? Why is everybody's answer school choice, private schools, charter schools, boarding schools, whatever? Why can't we fix public education? Is there a larger plot to people being ignorant to some of the things that are happening in our society? I'll let you all run with that. That's just a question. All right. So he talks about this, that we need to have some an essential justice for women, for the poor, for Black folks, etc. This is better understood if you read his book, Black Reconstruction, but that's a huge book. We won't go down that road. So he gives us this little piece right here that I think is essential. Who should rule? Those who combine strength with ability, unselfish devotion to the public good, and knowledge of what that good calls for. I want you to ask yourself if Du Bois's definition fits the candidates that we currently have for leadership for you subjectively. And if not, then I say that you should follow that train and try to figure out what's going on there. Who should elect? Children must be well educated, insanity prevented, and only those put under the guardianship of others who can in no way be trained to speak for themselves. Such possible voters must be regarded not as the sharers of a limited treasure, but as sources of new national wisdom and strength. We have a whole issue going on right now as to whether those who have been incarcerated should be able to vote. Those who have done certain crimes should be able to vote. Should someone who has been convicted of certain crimes be able to run for president, right? Biggest thing he's saying here is we are responsible for epistemically and morally training the next generation to be able to participate in government well, we're liable for that. If they can't do it, then there's an issue with the state, not the issue with the people. And I think that's powerful. What must happen for this to happen? Okay, if America is to ever become a government built on the broadest justice of every citizen, then every citizen must then be enfranchised, not disenfranchised. There must be temporary exclusions until the ignorant and their children are taught, or to avoid too sudden an influx of inexperienced voters, but such exclusions can be but temporary if justice is to prevail. It's fascinating to me that we have a political landscape that doesn't require anything of you educationally in order to vote. You hit 18, you can do it. Now, I'm not saying there's anything bad about that. What I'm saying is that we're assuming that you all have a certain sort of background and teaching by the time that you hit that marker to be informed voters that can weave through BS, that can weave through falsities, fallacies, etc. And yet our schools are not teaching you all the critical thinking skills necessary to do that. I think there's a real problem there, right? Okay, last one. Let's talk a little bit about Charles Mills and Carol Pateman in tandem, shall we? Hold on, that's not it. Stop share. Share. There we go. No, that's not right. There we go. All right, let's start from this slide. Get this thing to lift. There we go. There we go. Okay. So we've talked a bit about this dichotomy already. I won't spend a lot of time on this. State of nature is supposed to be the Wild Wild West. Social contract is a civil state. That's how Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and even Rawls sort of talked about it. Let's investigate that further, right? So here's what Charles Mills's argument is. The racial contract is a conceptual bridge between mainstream, specifically white ethics and political philosophy, that focuses on justice and rights in the abstract, and the world of Native Americans, African Americans, etc., and their political thought being focused on issues of conquest and imperialism, right? So the normative use of the racial contract is to generate judgments about social justice and injustice. The descriptive use of the racial contract, because again, normative means universal, descriptive means particular, right, is to explain the genesis of the society and state, the way the society is structured, and the way government functions, and people's moral psychology, okay? So I want you to think about this. We talked about all of these different authors, John Stuart Mill, Rousseau, John Rawls, etc., Hobbes, Locke, all the people who are our bedrock of political philosophy. They think about justice and rights in the abstract, especially Rawls and his idea of ideal theory. And then we also think about these things in sort of antithesis to some of the way in which Indigenous and Black folks exist and inhabit the world. So when we see things like the uncivilized, the savage, the whatever, we know exactly what that's signaling toward. And we have to ask the question, does this actually like formulate a sense of true justice, right? So he thinks about this based on an idea of global white supremacy. Again, I always tell my students not to think about this as about individual white agents. I want you to think about the ideology that has existed historically that has led to the conquest of literally half of the globe at one point, where European imperialization and colonization literally conquested half of the world, right? We're talking about parts of Asia. We're talking about all but 2 countries in Africa, the majority of South America, the majority of Latin America, and definitely the project known as the United States, and even parts of Canada, right? The reason why There's a French part of Canada where it's French speak in Canada is because of French colonial rule in Canada at one time, right? We look at a good chunk of the history of the globe, and there is something called a global supremacy, specifically in a larger idea of whiteness, right? So there's a formal and informal rule, there's socio-economic privilege, and there's norms of differentiated distribution of material wealth and opportunities, which includes benefits, burdens, rights, and duties, right? Let me skip down to the idea of this creates a difference between persons and subpersons. This insinuates a differencing and privileging, and it also includes an exploitation of bodies, land, and resources, and the denial of equal socioeconomic opportunity. So this is what I like to tell my students, because again, I teach the majority white students. So how do I want you to think about Mills's argument? This is the most important piece. All white people are beneficiaries to the contract, though some whites are not signatories to it, right? So beneficiaries just means that I gained something or something did not happen to me. There's some privileging that comes with the body in which I inhabit. Let me give you, we'll leave race and we'll come back to race, right? How Carol Pateman thinks about this via Simone de Beauvoir and other folks, right? There's a certain privileging of being the first sex versus what Simone de Beauvoir calls the second sex, which is women, right? Woman. Man is the central base. Woman, female, abstraction of the first. There are ways in which men have benefits that have nothing to do with their ideology at all, right? Before I married my wife and I was going on dates with, as a single man, I never once had to text a friend saying, yo, here's the license plate number of my date. Here is where I'm going to be. If you don't hear back from me at this time, check in on me, blah, blah, blah. I never felt like I had to do those safety things, right? That's a benefit that I have as a man that has nothing to do with my ideology or anything that I've done that has to do with my body in the social political landscape that I exist in, right? So there's a benefit that some of us have. In the same ways, yes, you can be disenfranchised as poor white folks or queer white folks or et cetera. But there's still benefits, whether it's just experiences you don't have to have or experiences that you do get to have, right? If people don't follow you around in a store thinking that you're going to steal, that's a benefit, right? If people don't automatically assume that you're the most deficient, intellectually deficient person in the room, then that's a benefit, right? So all he's saying is that there are some benefits that people can have, even if they're not signatories to the ideal. Now, a signatory, I would say, is something like the KKK, right? Somebody who signs on to the idea of global white supremacy. You don't have to sign on to it and be a follower of its ideology to gain its benefits, right? So you don't have to be the left with tiki torches, right? It may very well be the case that the issue of race in the United States is more like the right, where we have a disproportionate amount of Black folks who are in jails versus their population here in the United States, all right? So he says we need to think about this as non-ideal theory. He's coming for Rawls. He's saying, let's not think about this as some sort of thought experiment. Let's deal with things on the ground. And so there's three main ways he wants to think about it. The first one is existential, right? It exists. Global white supremacy exists. The second one is a conceptual claim. It's a political system, not just political in the sense of like our three branches of government. Politics deals with anything about the ways in which people and groups engage the world, right? In the choices that we make. And then the methodological claim that as a political system, it can be theorized as a contract between those who are actually able to contract with each other. And in this case, that's whites. In Carol Pateman's sense, that's women, men. And then whether they're signatories of the contract or not, everybody else has to get on board with it, right? We have to exist in a world that's framed by it. There's also a sort of claim that could be said that this deals with sexuality as well, about heteronormativity or cisgenderedness versus those who are queer identifying. I don't know if you all can hear this.
Then it means I'm going to suggest.
I don't think you all will be able to hear this, so don't worry about it. I think it's interesting that this idea of developed versus not developed, the civil versus not civil, the countries that we want to travel to versus the ones we don't want to travel to, etc., often falls in line with this sort of civil versus barbarian dichotomy that falls very much in line with how we think about first world, second world, and third world countries, right? So there are three main parts of the racial contract that he outlines. The first one is moral, right? Who is it permissible to do wrongs to and who is it not? And we've seen that with the killing of Breonna Taylor or Trayvon Martin or George Floyd or whatever, right? There's a moral issue here. Who is allowed to do what to who, and why? When does certain punishments come into play and when do they not, right? So there's a moral aspect to that. If we can imagine a world where two young girls are abducted and we treat one abduction one way and the other abduction a different way based off of the tone of their skin or the wealth that they come from or whatever, then that means that we have a moral racial contract at play, right? There's a political one where these sort of moral things are codified into our social framework. I wish I had enough time to show you all in Theodore Allen's book, The Invention of Whiteness, Volume 2, where he literally talks about after Bacon's rebellion, the idea of whiteness is changed, and there's actually laws that are codified that then include the Irish and the Scottish and other people who were not considered white at that time because they were super afraid of Black folks, indigenous folks, and poor white people banding together against wealthy white folks, right? So there's a way in which the racial contract deals with the law and how the law codifies a certain sort of privileging of some and disenfranchising of others. If you don't believe that, keep that in your back pocket to next week when you watch the documentary 13th that talks about the 13th Amendment that literally makes slavery impermissible except if someone is incarcerated. Then think about how mass incarceration works in the United States. Last but certainly not least, there's an epistemic or epistemological aspect to it, where norms and procedures for determining what counts as moral and factual knowledge is determined. Use philosophy. It's the greatest case study ever. Who are the bedrock philosophers of color or women, etc.? And why is there so few of them, if any, compared to white men? Because what we consider knowledge is often constrained and functioning through a very limited scope, right? Same thing with morality. We think that Western morality and Western ways of approaching morality are the end all be all. And hopefully this course has shown you all some other ways to think about it, right? So this is the last that I'll say about this. The racial contract is real. It's unlike the social contract, which has boundaries and stuff within it. The racial contract is global. It is a shift of ethics and law for the world, and it addresses the binary within the contract between the civil man and the native or the barbarian savage. That's what he's getting to, right? Trying to wrestle with why the way the world is the way that it is as it pertains to race. And he and Carol Pateman write together, and they talk about what this means with sex. They talk about what this means with class, etc. There's an intersectional lens we can bring to this to go back to Patricia Hill Collins, right? And Kimberly Crenshaw. But that's the important stuff that I want you all to understand. There are three main ways that the racial contract ends up playing out. There's the expropriation contract, right? The idea of divine destiny, that taking other people's stuff is the divine right of the colonizer or the imperialist. There's the slave-free contract, which means that there's a right to enslave natives and Africans. In case you all didn't know, the first There's indentured servants who were like the lower class folks from Britain and other areas that were the first who were working on the lands in the United States. Then you have a certain sort of enslavement that happens to indigenous folks. Then you have chattel slavery on Black folks, right? And then you got the colonial contract, which legitimized European rule over other nations in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. And we're not immune from this. If you want to go down a rabbit hole, look at the United States history of how it got Guam. Look at the United States history as to how it got Hawaii. Look at the United States history with Puerto Rico, right? Look at how we get Texas and the other states that we get with the Mexican-American War, right? Look at all of that stuff. And you'll see that we have in our own historical landscape, whether it's the Trail of Tears, Japanese internment camps, the Carolinas that had their own eugenics movement, the Carolinas and California. We have our own history of stuff. That means that we got to deeply investigate our own ethics and political philosophy for ourselves. So hopefully that was helpful, looking at the 5 readings for this week. If you have any questions, you all can shoot me an email. This is our last lecture. So everything from here on out, you will not see my face, but I will be present for the rest of the course, our last 10 days together. Let me just remind you to finish strong, fight hard, and to do your best. See you later.